Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining in. And what I want to do in the coming 20 minutes, well, I will try to reflect what is really happening in the local entrepreneurial venture capital ecosystem and the reason why it's blooming lately. And maybe I'll be able to equip you with a mindset of how you can initiate some processes within your country or some things you are involved in. So we're talking about Israel, so let's start from scratch. Israel is really a small country, tiny actually, physically, but also we are just over 9 million population. And we're ranked, I think, 96th in the world. And it's dramatically smaller than the larger and growing economies of the world, of course. But yet, Israel keeps its position 3 consecutive years as being one of the top 5 high-tech markets in the world. And it is reflected in the, volume of capital raised. For example, in 2020, more than $11 billion were raised. And it does not end there, because during the last 5 months, over $10.5 billion were raised so far. And, I've been working on this slide during the last, maybe 2 weeks. And I had each and every day, or maybe 2 days, to update this screen because it's already outdated around, I think we're more than 11 billion now. And what's interesting here is that these investments are not limited only to early stage investment or ventures, but it's really expanded into more value companies, more valuated or late stage ventures that valuated in more than $1 billion, also known as unicorns. Now you can see to the right that in 2020 we had 16 unicorns. We are now not in 18 as written, again, outdated. We are just about 21 as of today. And just to note, when you look to the left, 16 unicorns in 2020 compared to the largest or maybe the most advanced economies in the world, that you will agree with me is a unique phenomena in a way. So having such an ecosystem or growth, it really leads to a state where the rarity of this or the scarcity of unicorns really decreases. And we're entering an era where multi-billion is the new 1 billion. So Israel has now 5 decacorns with more than $10 billion valuation. And there are really 3 more in the pipeline with more than $9 billion to date. So that's a lot of information. And as Rick just said, Israel up until lately and recently was considered and defined as the startup nation. So anyone who knows Israel know that this very definition is unique or quite a phenomenon by itself because of the geopolitical and the environmental condition that Israel faces. But I think, you agree with me again that by showing all this data and information that I just showed you in the last 5 minutes, that that Israel has shifted from a startup nation to a unicorn land. Now, what does it actually mean? So back to the definition of startup nation, there was a highly respected, highly appreciated book published by Dan Senner and Saul Zinger back in 2009. And it was a book that dealt with the phenomena and the impact on the Israeli ecosystem with a very optimistic view, again, a phenomena. And the book Optimism was criticized later on with the rightful claim that while Israel had succeeded Israel and its early stage venture, we'll say, to create a pretty amount of value during the early stage of those ventures, the value actually was lost because someone else, I mean, global companies and M&As, et cetera, took that value. And those voices came from, some influencers and some local industry and ecosystem leaders, and it did its thing. So the real leapfrog was when Israel made, I think, a strategic decision to turn startups that set up for sale or maybe flotation in other countries into a large, successful multinational companies headquartered in Israel, operate globally with, again, thousands of employees and significant revenues. So when you look at it, and that was like, we were called Startup Nation just a decade ago, and we have changed. So what's really interesting for me, maybe to discuss with you, is circling around three questions. One, who really created this change? What can all of us learn from the change of the Israeli case? And why is it so important? So let's start, I think, with the third one. Why is it so important? So when companies are not sold at the early stage, well, most of the value is kept within the country. Most of the knowledge and the know-hows, the taxes, and all the aspects that relates to employment remain in the country. And you can see in the blue line here really depict, well, there are two matrices that deal with that are worth looking at this aspect. And the first one is really GDP per capita. And if you look at the blue line here, you can really see the consistent growth and significant growth of the Israeli economic over the past 30 years compared to the major economies of the world. Some are just now growing as China and India, but they're huge. And of course, United States is the leader of entrepreneurship and high tech, etc. But you can also see United Kingdom as an example, which is not showing a constant growth. Okay, it's kind of a struggling. And any one of you here knows who's number one in the world in GDP per capita? You can like break out or maybe write in the chat if you want. And what is the GDP per capita? Ranked number one in the world. Anyone knows? So I see you write some stuff. So Israel is ranked 29. And what's interesting, equally interesting, is to look at the GDP growth rate. And you can see that Israel is growing, its GDP growing 3.5%, which is double the OECD rate. So pretty massive growth regarding GDP. This is one metric. The second metric really deals with what is called employment multiplier. And the Israeli CEOs Forum has been following this metrics in the recent years. And what it really shows is the ratio between non-tech employment and tech or R&D employment. So to the left, you can see that when a company is bought during the early stage to a global company, for example, or M&A, most of the time, most of the operation go outside of the country. Maybe sometimes they leave an R&D center. And when that happens, the ratio between non-tech jobs is usually for every two high-tech or R&D employment or jobs, there are less than one non-high-tech job. and opposed to that, when the company is a multinational, playing globally company, then it's about 3 jobs to every 2 high-tech jobs, three non-tech jobs to each 2 high-tech jobs. And well, more jobs brings more the economic rise. So this is a very important parameter or metrics that you should follow country-wise, but you can also divide it into categories of vertical-wise. So who created this change? So there are many responsible for the change, but I would like to focus on 2 main ones that you might find useful. The first one is really government initiatives, and we can go back to the 90s. Israel government had decided to, well, fund the funds, actually. Give money to, with a profound long-term business model to actually help them, or maybe drive them to invest in local entrepreneurship. So back in the 90s, it was a new thing to do. I think only the United States was really had such an approach with the Silicon Valley and the semiconductor industry. But that was, and I think many countries nowadays do the same. It can be called grants, but it's really funding the funding the funds, but governmental funding the funds. Now, in Israel nowadays, the ecosystem is well developed. So the National Innovation Authority, this is how it's called in Israel, is really focused on funding high-risk initiatives that have impact, environmental and social effects. And you can say that as riskier the venture is, but again, convincing and with the potential, then it will be the higher chances you're going to get your funding directly from the government. And this is very interesting. So this is one approach. And the other approach that, again, few countries take into consideration or even put the right amount of emphasis into, is that the same authority is involved, accompanies and promote innovation, implementation, and assimilation in Israel and outside, meaning that they're not supporting only the ecosystem as a development, research or development of early stage or maybe even later stage companies, but they do take care that the solutions of those ventures are implemented in different varieties of entities internally in Israel and outside. And here lies a great value which few countries, again, give proper emphasis for. So this is the government, but it's not end there. There are the people. And when you talk about people, then once there are entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs that manage to run a scale up and maybe successfully exited at the end, they become experienced. And they know the processes, they know the obstacles, they know what need to be done in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and they just build more smarter companies later on. They rebuild companies and they do it smartly. Now, they also believe in that method. So they reinvest in other and the money that they earned, or some of the money that they earned, they reinvest in new ventures. So it's kind of a cycle, and they help them. They mentor them, they open doors, they connect, they fund talents, they do a lot of they put a lot of effort in order to help those new startups. And they create by this kind of a network effect that brings in local investors, different ones than they used to be. I mean, more bigger funds, maybe family offices, et cetera, and also external ones from outside. And I think that more 70% of the funding in Israel is really external. investments. So that creates kind of a snowball effect that grows and grows and grows into a self-propelled machine, I would say, or maybe kind of a perpetuum mobile, which means it feeds itself. Now, it's what I think we are a strategy tools community, and one of the tools that I really like called the ecosystem shakers map, that if you go through it, it really helps you to map out who are the key ambassadors or key investors or key entities or key initiatives that you can find in your ecosystem. And I keep updating it regularly within my work. And it helps find weaknesses and maybe growth potential, actually. So try it and use it. I use it a lot. So those two factors, the government and the people, are added to, well, I would say other factors that had been previously, but still made the change or made the difference in Israel from maybe other countries. And the first one, well, it's the Israeli military, or it's called IDF. And what's happened during the last, I think, 40 years is that the IDF needs were aligned with the global trend. We could go back to the semiconductors back in the, I think, 70s or maybe 80s. Rick knows that more than I do. He comes from that. And up until lately, the cybersecurity and the AI were the major, and now we are entering the deep tech era, I think. So the thing here is that the Army builds units, and one famous unit called the A200, no one heard here about this unit, but what it really provides to the ecosystem is a constant delivery of well-experienced and maybe disciplined workforce that keeps coming once the mandatory period ends. So that is pretty much an asset that is the ecosystem has. Now you should find your own asset in your country. I will talk a little bit more later about that. So this is one additional thing. And the second one, Israel has more than 400 multinational companies that has their R&D in Israel, or maybe branches in Israel. And when you sum it with the TTOs and the academics and the model that Israel has adopted, or not adopted, but created regarding the commercialization of IPs, it's really, again, we're talking about phenomena as academics from all over the world are really studying the model. I just had a conversation last week with the Icelandic guys doing work regarding TTOs, and he asked me some things regarding TTOs, and well, the thing you need to understand regarding this is that when you have such a efficient way of research coming to commercial companies in a fast way, that brings value to those early stage ventures very quickly. So this is why you can see Israelis ventures becoming so much valuated so early. And when you do that, well, the multiplier rise to unicorns. So this is, again, a major thing you should look at your country. How can you attract R&D? How can you attract the better methods of commercialization of IPs? And the link between academics and, well, the ecosystem.
Quick time check, by the way. So we're through the official part of your talk, but I don't really care. Continue on, wrap up, but I do want to spend a little bit of time for Q&A. So when you have a chance.
3 minutes.
Cool.
Okay, so the last question is really, what could all of you learn and act from the Israeli case? So it really depends who you are and what your starting point is. So if you are a mentor, a scale-up coach, or a startup coach, discuss this in the very early stage with the founders that you escort. So, and you can use a lot of tools, of study tools, and that really can help you plant the idea of building a multinational companies within and keeping it within the countries, as opposed to maybe the glowing early exit or maybe the M&A scenario. So this is one thing. If you are an ecosystem leader or government, again, find and utilize your country's strength. I would say, let's take Norway, for example. Norway is known for its ocean tech and offshore tech and energy tech. Well, Norway has lots of shores and seas, and it's a natural strength or vertical strength. So you should look and utilize this strength and map out the shakers and support. Support innovation in clusters, collaborative. Well, after you map it out and you find some growth potential, then initiate clustering and initiate collaboration between resources. Companies that share resources, data, know-hows, etc., etc. So if you are a corporate strategist, almost if you embed within your strategy investment, also known as CVC or co-investment with other companies, you will help your country eventually. You will follow your own strategy, but you will help for your ecosystem. And again, lots of tools that will help you do that and encourage not silos, but collaborative approach. And last but not least, if you're a capital manager, you have a lot of power in your hands. So take an approach of paying it forward, meaning help those entrepreneurs not in the view of equity and ROI, I would say, but really try to help, because if you will help and other VCs will help, and that will bring the value back to you, and cooperate with VC. And in Israel, there is a fierce competition, but there are also collaboration. They are sitting next to each other in the same event, and they do collaborate. So think about collaborating between VCs. So if all of this happens, and with this, I'm going to finalize my session. If all of this happens, then the stars really align. Outsiders look at your country inside and try to understand what is happening over there, want to take part of the party. And the snowball is growing and growing really fast. So it's been a pleasure, and thanks. Thanks. So if anyone wants to discuss later on about the local ecosystem and think of things, I will be happy.
Nicely done. I learned a lot, actually. That was really good. Before we open up for questions, I just wanted to show off the shirt that I'm wearing right now. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
It's a philosophy. It's what we live every day. And I think it's super cool because you've discovered the same thing that made Silicon Valley what it is today, which is this success breeds success. This development of community. And you didn't mention angel investors, but that was implied here in mentors, and everybody's part of the community, and it grows like that. And Israel has found that as well. So that's, I knew that, but the way you described it was super cool. So nicely done. With that, I'll open it up for questions, comments. Please. Please, Glenn.
I'm sorry, Rick. Nir, thank you so much. Quick question on the multinationals and their R&D and the innovation happening in Israel. I've noticed recently that there's a decentralization of innovation happening as companies are trying to get more closer to the end consumer and try to get all these weak signals. With that said, specifically in the case of Panama and Costa Rica, there are many multinationals that have set up their shop initially as part of a labor arbitrage focus, right? Reducing costs, centralizing shared service, and what have you. We're now starting to see this innovation or urge to innovate happening also in these centers. Can you comment a little bit if you have seen a similar transition happen in Israel prior to it becoming more of an R&D innovation-driven focus? And what tips can you give me as I engage with these multinationals? Thank you.
Well, I must say that R&D in Israel started very early. I mean, I'm in my 40s. I live not in Tel Aviv. I live in 1 hour north into Tel Aviv in a city called Haifa. And when I remember myself, we had an Intel R&D, you know, and later on Google came and all of, so to tell the truth, I'm not exactly, I don't really know what it, I mean, it's kind of, again, it's kind of a snowball. I mean, once you are, well, you develop things, you get the credit. You get the credit of developing things. And then you kind of attract more and more. But I advise you to learn, I mean, answering your question, I advise you to learn the TTOs and the commercialization of research more than focusing, I mean, more than focusing on how to attract the R&D, because that will come, I think, later on as natural growth, I would say. And there are things to learn. I mean, how you rapidly bring the research to the knowledge of new entrepreneurs. It is complex thing. Once you know how to do that, it's easy. But it's a complex thing, and it is a thing to learn. So focus on that, I think, in my honest opinion.
So in my background, Israel was never a source of cheap labor. So it didn't start there. It was always a source of knowledge, R&D capability. There's a strong expat community here in Silicon Valley in New York that wanted to encourage development in Israel, funded a lot of it. There was a specialized internal market associated with communications and security that was really anxious to sort of have that technology developed within Israel for use within Israeli military and other areas. And so it's a fairly unique situation. And not necessarily easy to replicate. China is a little bit of that because they wanted to develop that capability internally and grow out of sort of a labor force and into being more intellectual and more intellectual property, self-serving and so on. But yeah, Israel over time, and I was in Haifa not 40 years ago, but something like that, and visited the R&D facility there. But it has spun up as a result, and now it's super self-sufficient. I'm opining. It's not about my experience, but I am a fan. Any other questions, particularly in ecosystem development? I'm going to spin it around, and as we sort of close down here, tell us about your experience with Scale Up Coach, and other tools like that within Israel.
Well, it's I mean, everyone you talk now in Israel, well, is involved in a way with a unicorn. I don't know, everyone I talk to, and the thing is that it's a bit harder here to be external coach, I would say, or advisor to such a well-developed network, because this network is, I mean, again, people here know how to discuss. Most of the people know how to fundraise and know how to grow efficiently. They used to think, one of the reasons I didn't talk in this lecture is that, well, when it was a startup nation, people used to move from Israel to the Silicon Valley, for example, to be close to the market. Now, the world has changed, and we are all globally all together. And if you can do the right, GTMs, I would say, go to market, etc., then you don't necessarily need to be in the Silicon Valley in order to become a world leader. And that's what I think happening now. So these kind of discussions are really what I'm doing with scale-ups, to engage them and to really, and right from, you know what, it's not only scale-ups, it's also startups, meaning that when you're talking with them very early, stage and bringing them. I'm not talking about the investor readiness programs that, you know, strategy tools, it's very easy to facilitate with. When you talk about it with entrepreneurs very early at the stage, this makes, I believe that it makes a lot of difference. And they're also succeeding in fundraising. So it's also, so I know if to relate to the global cheap money era that we are all living in, but we do succeed to fundraise. So I guess it's working.
It's a good answer and a good segue. So yeah. I'm going to thank you, Ner. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Nice.